a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, revisionists, reconsiderers, and truth scrutinizer. Welcome to this first show of our rebranded podcast, Memoir Nation, formerly right-minded. It's a little weird to say that, Grant, to acknowledge it, but we're feeling into this new role. And, it's going to feel really similar to what you know, listeners. I mean, I'm Brooke, one half of this hosting team of what has been right-minded for almost 7 years. And Grant is here too, my trusted and trusting co-host. And Grant, here we are. We're new, but the same.
Yeah, it's so nice to be new but the same. Maybe that will be the title of my memoir, in fact. New but the same, the Grant Faulkner story. I'm certainly very excited to explore memoir writing in all shapes and sizes, on the page and behind the mic, for my next new endeavor. And I'm greatly comforted and inspired to do this with you, Brooke.
Me too. And it's appropriate that we'd be launching a rebranded show with today's topic about reconsidering what is true. Truth shifts, it really does. Our understanding of truth changes over time, and we can hold a very solid set of beliefs, which we believe to be fundamental to what we know and who we are. And then those things can change because we change, or our understanding of things change. And we're not the same people over the course of our lives, of course. And all that goes for, all arenas of life. Grant, we started this thing 7 years ago, September. The show has evolved. We've evolved. Our understanding of what truth then was might look different to now. And that's what we're going to be exploring today with our guest, Jill Ciment.
Absolutely. Thinking back to 7 years ago, I was definitely a very different person. So I think the way we find and express truth keeps changing in fascinating and surprising ways. And that is perhaps what the show and life is all about, really, is to figure it all out. What is the truth? And Jill Ciment is an intriguing guest because she's done something that's both controversial and brave in revising her story, very publicly. And Jill wrote a book, just to give people background, called Half a Life, published in 1996, about meeting the man who would become her husband when she was 17 and he was 47. And that first memoir was centered around the idea, a shared myth perhaps, that she came onto him, that she initiated their relationship. She was his student. He was married. And importantly, he was the primary reader of her writing back then in 1996, kind of corroborating the events and encouraging and challenging her with her writing. And the book was a lot about her marriage to her late husband, Arnold, who, of course, was still alive at the time. And then, another 30 years passes, and here we are. And Jill's new memoir, Consent, really challenges the truths put forward in Half a Life. It's a reconsideration of her first memoir, so much so that she plucks lines from the first book and examines them in consent, taking herself to task and asking questions that her modern self has more insight into, questions that her 1996 self maybe couldn't have even asked or wouldn't have known to, how to answer truthfully. So, Brooke, I know you had very mixed feelings about the entire premise of reconsidering a memoir. So can you say what that was about?
Yeah, and I'm going to preface this criticism by saying that I really appreciated and liked this book, Consent. It's well written. It's fascinating. I wrote about it on my Substack last June because I was taken by the entire premise. The part that troubled me had to do with the fact of truth as such a fluid thing to begin with, right? Like a memoir is written at a particular point in time in a memoirist's life. I got to thinking to myself, my Lord, what will happen if every memoirist decides that they want to re-examine their memoirs 30 years on? And then Jill also does this thing where she sort of places blame on memoir as a container, like she says that we collectively don't remember, and therefore in her book, she says, the point of view in memoir is curious. The writer must trick the reader and herself into believing that she actually remembers how she felt decades ago. And memoir is closer to historical fiction than it is to biography. And as with historical fiction, the reader often learns more about the period in which the book is written than the period that is being written about. I wrote on Substack that I didn't agree with that characterization. I do really understand where she's coming from, though, of course. I mean, she's a very thoughtful interview, too. I'm excited for people to listen. But people do vary dramatically in terms of what they remember. there's also essential truth versus the kind of truth that makes people out to be heroes. People write themselves as heroes or heroines. They make other people out to be heroes or heroines. I think there's a sort of lack of maturity sometimes that we'll see in memoir that causes that to be true. People bend history to be more flattering. This is an inherent problem with human beings, but not necessarily with the genre, right? Like I feel that the genre is flawed because human beings are flawed. And so I wrote in my Substack, that if memoirist truth is flawed or distorted or full of factual errors, a reckoning is undoubtedly warranted. But please, let's not blame the genre for a writer's skewering of truth. It's not memoir's fault if writers believe their own falsehoods or misrepresent their stories.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thing to consider, Brooke, this idea of what we believe to be true. And after all, we all have friends or acquaintances who have a tenuous relationship with truth, and maybe we even do. It's very much the case, for instance, that narcissists believe their own truths, and there are pathological liars in the world who build truths out of lies. I can think of one on the national stage, on the global stage right now. Not going to mention his name, but we've been living in an era of rewriting history, and what we see is that the human mind is very suggestible. So it seems that memoir is perhaps a minefield for untruths or partial truths. So what's your take on this, Brooke? And does the very fact of our challenged relationship to truth spell trouble for what memoir purports itself to be?
You bring up an important point. Truth has always been a fraught subject where memoir is concerned. Many memoirists have written on the topic, including the great Mary Karr, who writes about truth in The Art of Memoir. She said, "A memoirist forging false tales to support a thesis, heroes versus villains, for example, never trusts the reader with her own complexity. She fears disapproval, and this lack of vulnerability kills a book." And Karr's take on truth resonates with me because memoir does require a lot of things: self-interrogation, discernment, a willingness to examine your own need to be right or good, or to paint ourselves or others in a certain way. And I have worked with a lot of writers over the years where I could feel them pulling the truth in certain directions, right? Toward that villainizing of someone, toward lionizing someone. And so it's a genre that begs its writers to be curious, to challenge themselves, to scrutinize themselves. Of course, I will note that Jill is absolutely doing that in Consent, right? So it's like she's sort of opening this troublesome piece of memoir and stirring it up and being like, hey, take a look and what do you think? And some writers are more up for this task of self-scrutiny than others.
Definitely. It's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking of one of the rules of fiction, at least really good fiction writers do this, is that they know their villains never really think of themselves as villains. In their minds, villains tend to be maybe heroes or in the right somehow. So it's our duty, as you mentioned, to write with grace and generosity and a large degree of perspectivism and self-scrutiny and more. One thing that I'm super interested in is, I know you recently taught a course about the difference between truth and authenticity in memoir, and those words are so closely related and oftentimes confused. So I was wondering if you can share a bit more about what you explored there.
Yeah, for sure. Because when I teach memoir in my long course, I often talk about emotional truth. That's what felt true in the moment, right? Like, even if you don't remember every detail precisely, it's important that memoirists allow themselves not to have to be so precise because we don't remember everything that happened. And so memoir is really built upon what we know or believe to be true. And so that already is a flawed container, right? Notably. Authenticity is different, though. Authenticity is about being real, being yourself, expressing something that resonates deeply with your core experience. And then that involves checking in with your essence, by which I mean like your truest self that allows vulnerability and that doesn't consider what other people think or what other people need. So again, we got to go back to that idea of self-interrogation, because too many memoirists are stuck in this space of like, oh my God, what are other people going to think? What do other people need? How do other people need me to show up on the page, or themselves that I am writing about to show up on the page? So it's tough to do, no doubt, but it also makes me realize why it makes more sense that many memoirists tackle their memoir when they're older, like when they have more perspective, because it takes a lot to consider and reconsider Reconsider. You said, I like that word, perspectivism, by the way. And, just the depth and independent thinking and willingness to go into quote unquote truth, right? Really, regardless of who might get their feelings hurt in the process. And so memoirs are served up a really tall order, which is, truly all the more reason why I admire everyone and anyone who takes on the genre.
Yeah, I actually, it's the one genre that I've written in where I have questioned the very writing of it more so than anything else because of those risks and that responsibility. And it's so fascinating. I'm curious if this might be a trend among some memoirists to essentially rewrite a past memoir. And I know I've recast many parts of my life as I've gotten older, either because I've softened or I just understand different things differently. And when we're young, we're often just not equipped with deep enough perspectives, understanding or nuance. And one interesting aside to this conversation is I've been thinking about Monica Lewinsky's podcast, Reclaiming, because she reclaims her story in a way that's not entirely dissimilar from Jill Ciment's. I mean, time has to pass for her to just be able to see the truth. So I look forward to exploring truth and authenticity and shifting stories with Jill after this short break.
Welcome back, everyone. We have Jill Ciment with us today. Jill is the author of several acclaimed novels, including The Body in Question, Heroic Measures, and The Tattoo Artist, as well as 2 memoirs, Half a Life and her most recent, Consent. Born in Montreal and based in Brooklyn and Gainesville, Jill is known for her incisive exploration of art, mortality, and unconventional relationships. Her work has been adapted for film and widely anthologized. She's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. She's also a Professor Emerita of English at the University of Florida. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you for having me.
Consent is a reconsideration of your previous memoir, Half a Life. And I have to imagine that you knew by wading into this kind of self-critique and examination of your earlier work that you'd subject yourself to some strong feelings and opinions. And I would just love to hear what drove you to want to do this work and put it out into the world.
Even when I'm beginning a memoir, you just don't really believe anyone's going to read it. I mean, if I actually believed it, I probably wouldn't do it. So it's not like I envision how this is going to be. I mean, one of the shocking things about publishing is suddenly all the things that you kind of didn't think about are coming back at you. And this book was particularly an intense experience in reactions. A lot of people read an article or an interview and then they, without reading the book, and then made unbelievable conclusions about what it is. I mean, they don't do that with fiction, which is what I mostly write.
That's so interesting. Yeah. And I want to kind of probe that a bit because, obviously you began to see and understand things differently, your story differently, either just because you were examining your life from a different angle due to age, or perhaps as a result of losing your husband, who'd been such a profound influence on your life and your writing. And, it is universal, though, that all of us experience profound shifts in our understanding of truth and what's true, especially when it happens in the past. And so I'm just curious, what is your take on truth now in the wake of this experience of writing Consent?
Writing Consent also corresponded with the pandemic, which is when I wrote it. And it also aligned with me turning 70. So it's hard to say where Consent leaves off and all these other things factor in. I think one of the most interesting experiences I had when I was writing Consent was imagining how, if I should live to be 90 years old and still have my brains, okay, would I look back at Consent and see that it too told a series of truncated truths, because that's probably the better way in which to put it, rather than lies. And I started to realize that if I were to rewrite Consent 20 years from now, what I would probably talk about wouldn't be the initial part of our relationship, which I think I covered in 2 memoirs, but it would be the end of our relationship, because I didn't realize what my husband was going through as he aged from 70 to 90. And now I am. And now it's also making my relationship feel like what was truthful when I was writing Consent in my 60s about the end of our relationship is not true to the real overall thing. I think I glossed over that part of our togetherness in the same way my first memoir, glossed over our beginnings. So I think it's a continuous process as you age. I mean, if I lived to 120, God knows what I'd write.
I'd love to see that, the fourth iteration. In your book, there's a couple places where you take memoir to task a bit. You suggest that it's closer to historical fiction than biography. I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think it depends on the given writer, right? Like how much they choose to reinvent. Some people have profoundly good memories and other people don't. But certainly in reading your work, and thank you for saying that, because I read the New York Times article and then I could have easily not written it and kind of written it off, so to speak. But I was so curious, and the work really stands, and made me think so much about half-truths, misremembered truths, things that are made up stories more than lies. But of course, there have been like actively intentional liars, who have written memoirs. And so I'm curious if your own take on the genre is a cynical one, and can we read a memoir and hope or know that we are reading truth now?
Again, there's a difference between truth and accuracy. Mm-hmm. When somebody's recreating a scene in a memoir, putting in dialogue and having people move about the room in a certain way. I mean, we just know from eyewitness accounts how wrong eyewitness accounts are, So there's no reason to think your account is any better than an eyewitness account. And so what you're trying to do, at least what I'm trying to do when I recreate a scene that is just a kind of blurry memory in my mind, is I would have a blurry memory and then you kind of analyze what that memory really means. And then you try to recreate it so that the reader will have those same emotions that you think you had at that time. But, it's not that different than when you write fiction, I mean, it just isn't, because, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to take an emotion that you once had and give it form so that another human being can feel that emotion. And how you do that in language, it's not a huge jump from memoir to fiction. I mean, the difference between memoir and fiction is, it's more like fiction is you're facing a blank canvas and you start a painting. And a memoir is you go to a block of marble and there's already a vein in it. And so when you sculpt away, you have to follow the vein of the marble. That's probably the best way I can describe it.
That's beautiful.
Well, Jill, I wanted to ask you about the difference between authenticity and truth, since you might say they're like cousins, but different in that truth is what happened. In memoir, there's a license to write into the emotional truth, but what happened is good enough when it comes to memoir. But then there's authenticity, and that's how you show up on the page, and that's being real, and that's being who you are. And so I'm curious to know if you think you were authentic in Half a Life. You're re-examining the truth and the ways in which you were influenced by a shared myth with your late husband. But would you say that you showed up in that book believing with 100% accuracy that you were portraying what you thought was true then?
Oh, yeah, of course you do. I mean, you wouldn't write it if you did, just like the witness who goes up on the stand and swears that's the person that robbed them. Mm-hmm. Because you get invested in your myths. And once you invest yourself in the myth, it's, one of the things I did in Half a Life was I gave the book to my brothers. And if only one of them remembered it, I have 3 brothers, not all 3 of us remember our childhood in any way, shape, or form the same way. So I was only looking for one witness each time to authenticate a scene. And you could see that, even with shared history, nobody has the same memory. So, I mean, I think the memories you choose to remember, or the things in your life you choose to remember, is your own. It's a mythology. You're creating your own narrative and your own story. I mean, you could just remember brushing your teeth every night. That would be, a boring story, but that would be a story that you could make up. And I think what people do is they go back over their lives and they do what a novelist does. They try to tell a story in values as opposed to chronology.
Well, Jill, consent made me think a lot about human nature and self-awareness and discernment and a lot of other things about the stories we tell, notably about who we are in relationship versus outside of relationship, right? And how we morph and change. And we're different people in the context of different relationships. Like who I am in relationship with my wife, for instance, is different than who I am in relationship with my son, obviously. So how do you think about this idea of many selves? And how does that play into the way that we should think about writing our memoirs and the stories of our lives?
I mean, if how you define yourself as someone who has many selves, like I wouldn't think of that as the first way in which I would define myself, but obviously it's something that you've thought about. So it's how you would define yourself. So then the trick to telling your truth is to figure out a form that those different selves can accompany your story. I mean, that's why you're looking, each memoir is looking for its own form. It's not like you just arbitrarily have a structure for your memoir. So I think the different ways in which people think about memoir, and again, if you find the most fascinating thing about your life to be that you're always changing your inner persona in order to relate to someone else, then what an interesting way in which to come up with a form for that. Whether it's chapters or different selves arguing or however you do it, that would be your truth. It's not like you're telling a chronological story when you write a memoir. That's, I guess, what I'm saying.
Well, Jill, I've written mainly fiction in my life, and now I'm moving into memoir. And so I'm very interested in, fiction, memoir, how they inform each other and blend together in some cases. And in between your two memoirs, you wrote a lot of fiction. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how being a novelist informed your thinking about the topics you dove into with Consent.
Being a novelist has taught me that the way in which I tell truths or whatever, I tell my take on human behavior is through narrative, not through polemic argument, which is what nonfiction does. You have there's a person and they're making an argument. Not all nonfiction does that, and so it's that old show and tell thing, and so I think that writing scenes and seeing human life play out in imagined narratives is, I think I transfer that, all that knowledge that you have, I mean, it's really, writing books it's kind of like learning the scales on a piano so that when you sit down to write, you don't have to think about all those structures and stuff that you have taught yourself over the years. So I think that being a novelist really informed my writing as a memoirist. However, it's really different to write nonfiction. Fiction requires that you build a world so that you believe the story that is happening. Memoir doesn't have to build that world. Memoir relies on the fact that you know the world that it's taking place in. And I think that's the huge difference between them.
Well, there was a lot about the book that resonated with me. I'm married to someone 14 years older than me. Arthur was 30 years older than you. For a long time you wrote that the age difference didn't matter, but then there comes a point in his very old age when it starts to matter. And I thought you did a great job, managing like tenderness while still holding yourself accountable and scrutinizing some of the choices that you made. I did feel kind of like an armchair therapist to your experience. And I was curious to know if you understood just how deeply psychologically complex this memoir was going to be when you set out to write it.
I think if I thought that, I would never have been able to write it. So probably not. I I wrote the first 50 pages and knew what I was doing. And then I didn't know what I was going to do. And that was, you know, it happens all the time when I write a book. But so that the confidence in what I was doing was already embedded in those early pages. My breakdown comes about 50 pages in, you know, whereas other people's comes when they face the blank page at the beginning. So mine came later in the book. And so what do I do? How do I age these two people once they pass at least I passed the age of consent? And that was what I was trying to wrestle with for half the book. And that would be the hardest part.
Well, Jill, in closing, I want to circle back to Brooke's question about how you imagined your book would be received. And I wondered if you could share the breadth of the reaction to your work and any readers' impressions that moved you or troubled you.
I'm troubled by the idea that people judge what a book is about before they actually read what the book is actually about. And that was kind of a strange experience because, you know, I'm a very private person. I suddenly my story became something that they knew about before they read my work. And that was like, it's a reversal for me. You learn through each publication of each book that you send into the world, you learn kind of how delusional you are about thinking your books are about this, because everyone who reads them brings their own life story to it. It's not like we're all looking at a solid object and we can discuss something. I mean, language never works like that. So I think what I learned was that truths are just ephemeral things. And I don't have any more of an angle on that than anyone else. It was a humbling experience.
I imagine. Well, thank you, Jill. I loved the book and it was so thought-provoking. So thanks for writing it and thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back with this week's Substackin'.
Well, I'm doing it, Grant. I am plugging my own Substack about consent because there really is more to say on this topic. And I personally think that this one was one of my better Substacks. As I mentioned, the entire subject was just so rich for me and it really got the gears going. And for that, I am grateful to Jill for writing this book and giving us such deep food for thought.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. It was one of your best Substacks, definitely. And I think there's so much more there in our bonus content that we're now offering for subscribers to Memoir Nation. I said that, subscribers to Memoir Nation. I posed to Jill a question you mulled over in your Substack, which is, what would happen if everyone were to reconsider their memoirs, you know? And her response is really worth listening to. And yes, we are plugging and promoting signing up to become a Memoir Nation subscriber and denizen. You can do that at memoirnation.com and get access to our weekly newsletter and our bonus podcast content. But this is a seriously interesting question. You know, how would you feel if the writer of your very favorite memoir decides 30 years later to say, actually, here are all the things that were true, here are the things that weren't? You know, it opens up some questions when it comes to classics like Angela's Ashes, or I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, or really any book. And of course, any story can be subject to the author's scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because it's commendable at the same time, Jill's exploration of her truth and the desire to set it right. And I think her story is particular. It's informed by the age difference between her and her late husband, their shared myth, as she called it, and which I wrote to in my Substack, about how their relationship came to be, which clearly began to crack after he died. And Me Too also played a role. You know, she realized the age difference and the power differential, which she writes about in the book really eloquently, but she sees things in a different light as she steps into the age that Arthur was, right? Like she's 30 years behind him. And so it's a really interesting take on all of that, how perceptions shift. And perhaps she thought to herself, like, this is, how I portrayed things in Half a Life is just not how I see the world anymore. And then she decided she had to write a whole book about it.
Yeah, I agree. Her story is particularly ripe for reconsideration because of her age, for one, and the fact that her husband had a role in helping her write the first memoir. And Me Too, definitely. Me Too is definitely, it's ushered in a whole new era, a whole new consciousness, to the extent that I'm sometimes in disbelief over some pre-Me Too books and movies, to see. It was only a short while ago, but we were very unevolved back then. So, Brooke, in your Substack, you do write that memoir is a flawed container. And I love this characterization a lot because it's certainly true, but also we are flawed containers for our own stories, subjective as we are and influenceable as we are and malleable as we are. So perhaps memoir doesn't really stand a chance, given that it really is just a vessel for the stories any given person is going to tell.
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that memoir is just a mechanism, like you said, for us to tell our stories, and that how we tell them, like the degree of truth, omission, distortion, recreation is always going to fall to the individual. I think we have an expectation as readers that memoir is true. And over the years, I've certainly come to understand the subjectivity of truth on a much deeper level. And also that people have very different comfort levels when it comes to bending truth. Mm-hmm. Some people really get upset about it and they don't even feel like they can write things that they don't remember. And other people are just like, well, I'm just going to recreate that. No problem. So this is a great topic, one we will undoubtedly revisit, and one that we hope, dear listeners, has given you food for thought.
Yeah, and before we end today, everyone, we want to let you know that Memoir Nation is alive. We've officially kicked off the site where you can go and sign up to be a member for just $99. And out of the gate, that level of membership is going to give you a lot of perks, including a weekly newsletter with lots of memoir insights and tips and advice and encouragement. And it will also get you the bonus podcast content and a code for a free future class of your choosing. And it's a really good deal for $99. But also important to us is that it's support we need to launch this thing off the ground. So if you've been a longtime listener and you like the content you get on this show, there's going to be a lot more growth and exciting things in the weeks and months and years to come. So we invite you to join us at this $99 subscriber level. We'll make it worth your while, we promise. And we thank you in advance for supporting us to create the space we're dreaming of for writers like you. So visit memoirnation.com to check out the details, and we'll see you next week.